I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare Anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode. Hi, Elyse.
Hi, Kourtney.
How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm also doing okay. It's one of those weeks.
Yep, it is one of those weeks. But you know what is great to have in my life is this podcast and everything that we are doing with the podcast. It's been such a great start to the year, and I'm excited to dive into this episode about the representation of the early modern English military and Henry V.
Yes.
But first things first, we have some quick announcements and reminders. We are currently conducting a survey for teachers. If you are a teacher who teaches upper grades, secondary education, and you teach Shakespeare, have ever taught Shakespeare, or want to teach Shakespeare, we'd love to hear from you. And to fill out that survey, go to www.shakespeareanyone.com/teacher survey. The link is also in our episode description. And we'd love to hear from you about your experience teaching Shakespeare.
Yes, we've already received some surveys, and it's really informative. Like, from my memory of being a student in an English classroom in America, one of the things that was difficult was learning Shakespeare. And in its essence, Shakespeare is kind of another language, but there should be more tools and support systems for teachers to teach this subject. And we want to know what it's like for you teaching, how you want to teach, why you want to teach,
and what you think would make the biggest difference in your classroom. What would be of most help to you?
Yes. And the people who know best are the people who are teaching in the classrooms.
Yes. So again, if you would like to share your opinions with us, share your thoughts as a teacher, please go to www.shakespeareanyone.com/teacher survey. We've also had a lot of fun over on our Patreon so far this year.
Yes.
Last month, we have changed up how we do bonus content over there, and we're trying a bunch of different things and having a lot of fun doing it. Last month, we tried an early modern, for lack of a better word, cocktail.
Yeah, there was wine mixed into it, so I believe that would make it a cocktail.
It was a mixed drink, and we had a lot of fun trying it. We shared the recipe on our Patreon as well that we used in case you would also like to try the drink that is known as the Spiced Milk Aphrodisiac from John Tuff's cookbook, Fat Rascals Dining at Shakespeare's Table. If you would like to hear about our experience drinking the drink named for three things that should never be together, come join us over on Patreon. We also are very excited. This month, we are going to be watching and reacting to Grand Theft Hamlet, which is a documentary about a group of actors that staged Hamlet entirely in the world of Grand Theft Auto during the height of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, and this is really exciting because, like, my partner plays Grand Theft Auto, and so I'm familiar with the world, and I'm very curious to see how these creatives incorporated this Shakespeare story into a video game series that, like, I would not consider to be traditionally Shakespearean by any count. I would be like, oh, they're doing that to Baldur's Gate 3. I'm excited for Grand Theft Hamlet because I think it really resonates with our idea of, like, how do you make Shakespeare relevant and how can you place him in another format to like be engaging and fun. And so I'm really excited to see what this looks like. I hope that you will all join us. Watch it yourself and then join us over on Patreon to hear our thoughts.
Yes. And if you want to stay on top of everything that we've got going on here at Shakespeare Anyone podcast, we now have an email list. We send out monthly emails with just a roundup of everything that is going on in the world of Shakespeare Anyone. So if you never want to miss an episode or you want to stay on top of what we're doing over on Patreon, you can join our email list. The sign up link is in our bio, as well as on our website, www.shakespeareanyone.com.
Yeah, that's our housekeeping.
Yeah, those are the updates that we want to share with you today. Now, today, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about the early modern military and Shakespeare's representation of the military in Henry V. We chose this because Henry V is a war play.
Yeah.
And in this play that we felt like there was a lot to think about. The majority of the play happens in wartime. And while we have seen battles in Shakespeare in other plays that we've looked at so far, we haven't really looked at like historical wartime. So we wanted to dive a little bit more into like what did it mean to be at war?
Yeah, and this play begins with two characters talking about the like legitimacy of going to war, and it ends with the treaty. So from top to bottom, war and the war experience is at the forefront of this play. So it would be a great disservice to our exploration of this play to omit military history from our series.
Yeah, right. So I'm going to kick us off today. My reading comes from D.R. Lawrence's Reappraising the Elizabethan and Early Stuart Soldier, Recent Historiography on Early Modern English Military Culture. And in this article, D.R. Lawrence is working to address a pre-existing stereotype that existed for a lot of the 20th century about English soldiers and counter it by gathering together more recent research and discoveries in scholarship about what life was like as an English soldier and why Englishmen signed up to go to war, what their motivations were, why an individual might choose to do this with their lives. So again, Lawrence notes that for much of the 20th century, historians were portraying late Tudor and early Stuart soldiers as amateurs at best, incompetent at worst, who were part of a very outdated military tradition that was isolated from, quote, the transformations shaping warfare on the European continent, unquote. So, yeah, so like the point of view for a long time was that English soldiers of Shakespeare's time did not know what they were doing.
And they were behind the times from what was happening in continental Europe.
Yes. However, starting in the 1980s, these theories started to be tested and were found very lacking. And then since the 80s and 90s, additional scholarship in military history has sort of been like reappraising what English military life was like and really testing that like earlier depiction of the English as, you know, just like loutish incompetence. What that new scholarship has found is that English soldiery was actively engaged in new tactics and technologies that were emerging in continental warfare. So the exact opposite. Like they weren't just isolated and not practiced just because the country itself was not actively at war.
And also for a really long time, the country was like at civil war.
Yes. Basically just because the late Tudors, so like King Henry VIII to James I didn't really see active country on country wartime, just because they weren't fighting other countries on the European continent doesn't mean that they weren't participating in and aware of military developments that were happening in these wars that were happening on the continent. So in general, and I'll dig a little bit deeper into this later, English subjects were also motivated to participate in war efforts, this scholarship found, through mostly religious zeal, honor, and economic hardship. So during this time period, we've briefly talked about in other episodes the Protestant movements that are happening both in England and on the continent, and how Protestantism is growing. One part of that expansion of Protestantism were these wars of religion that were happening on the European continent. And English subjects were recruited as mercenaries to fight in these wars on the side of the French, or what is now the Netherlands.
Yeah, I believe that. Oh gosh, of course, now that I interrupted you, I can't remember the name of that person, but I know that there are people that we have talked about who like went to.
Yes, you're thinking about Ben Jonson, who was a volunteer soldier with the English regiments of Sir Francis Vere in Flanders to help fight for independence.
Okay. I was like, something's there. Something's a brewing.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. So we have talked about like some people who were at least going and fighting to support other Protestant nations in their wars. And according to historian David Trim, quote, a majority of English soldiers who fought in the wars of religion saw themselves as part of a Calvinist international, engaged in a holy war against the Habsburgs and the papacy, unquote. The fear of Catholicism created a very steady stream of English, Welsh, and Scots recruits for continental Protestant armies to fight wars for France and the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
And then these veterans would come back and facilitated improvements to administration, recruitment, and combat effectiveness within England.
Gotcha.
Additionally, English authorities at this time were completely overlooking the recruitment of English subjects to be mercenaries by Dutch captains and their proxies, as long as the Dutch captains and their proxies kept a low profile. Meanwhile, the Catholic country of Spain was prohibited from recruiting mercenaries in England after 1604. So it's very much like they're helping team Protestantism on the continent.
Right.
It's also interesting to note that service in foreign armies offered fewer opportunities for things like monetary, tangible rewards, such as grants of land or governorships. So that's why historians now think that like these men who decided to go do this were likely also driven by ideology as well as like whatever they were earning as a mercenary.
Gotcha. So because they participated in war in continental Europe, they weren't getting titles or lands like they were in like the 100 Years' War or the War of the Roses on English soil.
Well, this is also a time where England is trying to colonize Ireland, right?
Yeah, that's true.
There's war happening against Ireland for England. And in contrast to the continental armies, the troops who served England in Ireland were able to receive tangible rewards such as real estate, governorships, and appointments to positions in royal or noble households. And therefore, soldiers who fought in the war against Ireland might have had motivations other than religion for joining the cause. And this is because Ireland was a colonial project.
Yeah.
And then specifically for the nobility, it was an honor thing. We've talked a lot about like what it meant to be a honorable, noble, masculine man in the early modern era. And the ability to go to war and fight for your country was part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, according to historian Keith Thomas, the English elite in the late Tudor and early Stuart eras were great lovers of war, quote, with Tudor military men finding combat a uniquely satisfying experience, with the supreme end of life being the performance of military deeds, unquote. Thomas also denotes that there's a decline in the motivations or ideals of heroism towards the end of the 16th century, so late Tudor era, as like being a hero and having great feats of strength and vigor become less important compared to the disciplined obedience of a well-regimented army.
Mm-hmm.
And Thomas also notes, quote, military display, whether it be the retaining of personal armories or participation in jousts, at least until their demise in 1625, remained the means by which the English aristocracy and members of the gentry could showcase their status and masculinity. War energized the society while peace undermined it, generating sloth and effeminacy, unquote.
Mm.
So for the upper ranks of society, it was still like important to show off status and how manly they were through battles.
Through military
exploits.
Things. Yeah.
And then the veterans of the wars on the continent, they introduced infantry drills to England in the early 17th century. Meanwhile, the veterans of the Anglo-Irish Wars experienced a very different kind of war than what was happening on the continent. The Irish used guerrilla warfare tactics rather than large set-piece battles and sieges. Mm. And so captains in the Anglo-Irish Wars specifically found war to be, quote, an outlet for the social, political, and economic dissatisfaction, unquote. And these individual captains were energetic, effective administrators and soldiers. This is the ones who served in the Anglo-Irish Wars. And they were often very adept at managing the interests and intrigues of the competing factions that existed in Ireland at the time, mm-hmm. as well as their fellow captains. They were considered to be very resilient, stoic men who didn't care for religion And again, more about like money, the estates that they were going to procure. And they were seen as like being a little bit more brutal, self-interested, likely to be corrupt than the men who were going to the Netherlands or France to fight for God.
Right.
No matter where they served, the amount of scholarship around these military captains point to the existence of a growing class of, quote, experienced English officers motivated by a variety of factors and available to serve the Elizabethan and early Stuart governments, unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And then just to briefly talk about the common soldier and what their life was like, because a lot of this is coming from writings that exist from these aristocratic and noble men. There's some additional evidence for what life as the common soldier was like.
Mm-hmm.
There's evidence to support that good officers produced good soldiers. The majority of common men who participated in military service were drafted. But again, the stereotype that previously existed of them being sort of like lawless rabble may be an over-exaggeration. However, it was not until the 1580s that trained military companies were in a position to adequately protect the country. While they weren't the finest soldiers, they weren't like, I think not in Henry V, but in Henry IV, Falstaff is rounding up like just the worst of men, like children, and it's such a sad company. And like that is likely not true. While they weren't like the best, they were still like farmers and landowners who were interested in protecting their property, even if they weren't career soldiers.
Right. That depiction could just be a device for comedy because plays, like war plays, history plays, tragedies often have release for the audience through comedy. And so it's a more of an innovation or more of an invention by Shakespeare.
Yeah. And like one specific example of this, how the common soldier was decently prepared, like good enough, comes from historian Neil Younger's If the Armada Had Landed, a reprisal of England's defenses in 1588, where Younger is disputing historian Geoffrey Parker's claim that the militia was ill-prepared to meet a very specific invasion by the Spanish army. And Younger concludes that like while there was no quote-unquote army of English trained bands that were ready and able to shadow the Spanish Armada as it traveled up the channel, the Privy Council instead was just using a different tactic to call upon bands from southern countries to assemble as required and then make their way to London if the capital was ever threatened. So while this has previously been like, wow, they didn't even like have an army to meet the Armada and like, you know, it got this far up and like this is super inefficient. Younger argues that this was actually like a very efficient management of available resources, and that while like the trained bands were inexperienced, he stresses that, quote, there was a sizable pool of officers with military experience available to lead these men against the Spanish, unquote. You know, the effectiveness of the choices made by the Privy Council are still up for debate. It's something that like still could have been effective.
Yeah, and this is like preparation for something that didn't happen. So we don't even have, right? It's something that never happened.
The Spanish army never came ashore. It was an attempt that failed largely because of like tactics of the English Navy. So being like, oh, well, the English army wasn't ready if it like did happen is debatable.
There's no way for scholars to make a judgment on that if they weren't even provided the opportunity to test out if their preparation was able to like fend off the Armada. Like, yeah.
That
especially considering what we know about Henry V's campaign in France and how they were such a small army and they won against, you know, they beat the French. And in hindsight, we can say, oh, I see how they won, even though they had fewer soldiers and X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, sure. This army might have been defeated had the Spanish gotten to England and been able to get to London, but that didn't happen because the English Navy was very strong. We can't know that. So it's actually like the last thing that Lawrence notes is that debates over the effectiveness of English trained bands during the late Tudor and early Stuart periods still is contentious because they never like were actually tested like that. There was no invasion for them to defend against. England as a country did not like officially go to war because also like Ireland was not the same sort of like staged battles way that was happening on the continent. So we can't really say how as a country, a national army, they would have performed. So yeah, that is my reading.
Mm-hmm.
You have more on sort of like the laws of war that these soldiers would have been following
Right.
and how what is represented in Henry V is accurate to sort of the early modern army experience.
My reading is Henry V and the Law of War by Theodore Meron. And in this article, Meron is writing to investigate the laws of war in Shakespeare's play, and more specifically, the laws of war in like medieval England. And some of that did bleed into Tudor England and Elizabethan England. So this article is looking at medieval war and whether Shakespeare's representation is correct or representative of what was actually written by jurists and practiced by militaries in historical Henry's time and slightly in Shakespeare's time. But this medieval era was, part of the Hundred Years' War and the War of the Roses and the Crusades. So there's just a lot of war happening.
Yes.
Henry V as a play is a really great vehicle for considering late medieval practice rules of warfare. And the play itself narrates a wide range of events in warfare. The play begins with this assertion of the just cause of war, and it moves into the ultimatum or declaration of war, and then it goes into the conduct of war, and then finally the negotiation of peace, which are the pieces of a war. So medieval kings of England occasionally declare ordinances governing the conduct of war and punishment for violators. And Shakespeare's Henry declares this in 3:6 by saying, quote, "We give express charge that in our marches through the country there be nothing compelled from the villages, nothing taken but paid for, none of the French unbraided or abused in disdainful language," unquote. And so the law of war was really foundational to the role of a medieval king. Medieval kings were the power who declared war, and really whether a war was just or unjust came down from the king. And medieval jurists wrote about jus gentium, or the law of nations, or international law. And this predates like what we consider international law. But during the medieval era, there was this code of war conduct, and pertains to arms and civil law and the customs and the regulation of conduct of soldiers. And these customary rules regulated the conduct of soldiers within Christendom. So not between Muslims or other non-Christians. So really what we're talking about is the law of war between European countries in Christendom. So the first piece that Shakespeare really dramatizes in Henry V is this idea of there being just wars. In order for a war to be seen as just versus unjust, one party has to have like a correct claim for going to war against another nation. And we see this in Shakespeare's Henry V because Henry needs to establish a legal right to the French throne in order to justify going to war with France. And that's established with the Salic law argument from Canterbury about like the actual lineage and like
that there is a claim to the throne, that like this is a thing that like legally you can do.
Yes, exactly. So that's the first step in medieval warfare, is like establishing that legal right. And this is really important too, because during the medieval era, there was this idea of, like I said, a just and unjust war. And during a just war, the seizure by a prince of another's property and his refusal to restore it was the very first example of a just cause of war given by Renaissance jurist Suarez. And another jurist, Vittoria, also regarded a war designated to repossess property as a defensive and necessarily just war. And in those circumstances, it was, quote, permissible to recapture everything that has been lost, unquote.
Okay.
Some jurists of the Renaissance thought that war could be just for both sides at the same time, which other jurists rejected. However, war could be unjust for both sides when waged by mutual agreement. And so for Henry, the just war would be recapturing property lost by another prince. And it had to be proved that way, because if it was just a war about expanding England, that would be seen as an unjust war.
Yeah, so that he can say, the way that Salic law works, my inheritance has not been duly given to me. I can invade to get what should be mine.
Exactly. And if one member or both members are unjust aggressors, then they would have to make the expenses of war to the other side as well as damages. And so there's like a lot at stake. Making an unjust declaration of war during this period. And it especially is important for Henry to be like certain of this claim before declaring war, because this medieval legal system didn't really have a third party. And so the king or the prince becomes the judge of whether the war is just or unjust. And the sovereign is the one that's needed to declare war. Also, Henry needs to make sure that the declaration of war is just, because this legal concept of jus in bello, which is conduct of parties in armed conflict, he needs to make sure that like his soldiers are going into battle justly. So the first concern of the medieval soldier was to show that whatever it is that he gained from going to war was taken in a just war. If it was not taken in a just war, then restitution could be demanded of the medieval soldier. So a just war legitimizes acts that would otherwise be considered criminal if it was done during a war that was not just.
Mm-hmm.
And then a third reason why the war needs to be just is because the right of combatants to engage in war, and hence to be protected by the laws of war, also depended on the justness of the war. So demonstrating this just cause was important for practical reasons as well, such as raising troops and maintaining morale. And the two archbishops discuss this, like, you know, the right to the throne, the justness for war, especially when it comes to like the discussion of we need to raise troops, we need to have money to fund the war. So this is like a main principle within the early pieces of Henry V.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second piece of medieval warfare, law of warfare rather, is the declaration of war. So after a just war has been determined, then the king can declare war. And Shakespeare's Exeter in 2:4 declares war against the King of France. And the message states the claim to the crown of France, the legal basis for the claim in the law of nature and the law of nations, and the consequences for non-compliance, so going to war. And in the Middle Ages and the Elizabethan era, war was publicly declared by issuing letters of defiance, and it had to be with like all of those pieces. Although technically, Henry didn't actually really need to declare war on France, because at this period, England and France were in a truce from the 100 Years' War. That truce started in 1369 and it was going to expire in 1415. Mm-hmm. So the truce would have just expired and they would have resumed battle and war. But Henry specifically like declared war for the claim to the French throne.
Mm-hmm.
And while the medieval practice of the declaration of war was really standard, George Keaton, a modern commentator, believes that in Shakespeare's time, declarations of war were becoming obsolete and, quote, nations not infrequently found themselves at war without any further notification than the appearance of the army of one belligerent in the territory of another, unquote. So this like custom was starting to wane in Shakespeare's time. But Shakespeare is writing about medieval warfare, and he includes this detail, which is a standard of medieval warfare. Okay, another piece of medieval warfare that this play touches on is the responsibility of princes. Henry V discusses the king's responsibility for the death of soldiers from both a Christian perspective as well as a legal viewpoint. And Henry makes a clear distinction between official acts and private acts in his conversation with Williams when they're already in France. And that's his assessment, right. His perspective. Yeah, go ahead.
And he has that monologue of like, they don't know how much stress, like I'm super paraphrasing and interpreting, but the commoner doesn't know like how much the king spends thinking about their lives and like what the best thing to do is for the most people, the most subjects possible.
Yes. But even though he is like thinking about the welfare of his soldiers, legally, from a legal standpoint, Henry makes a distinction between official acts and private acts during that conversation that he has. And during the medieval era, the king is not liable for the acts of his agents. It's a law called respondere non sovereign. The king is not liable for the acts of his agents. However, a soldier's captain could be held responsible for his soldiers' illegal acts.
Okay.
So like Llewellyn would be responsible, which we see Llewellyn like bring Bardolph to punishment, right? Bardolph is punished for pillaging. The captain has him, you know, taken care of, executed. And like, that's a responsibility that the captain has to do because he's responsible for the soldiers' acts. And during this time, also, community could also be held responsible for not correcting a wrong from a private citizen if they're made aware of it and the act is continuous. So, like, everybody but the sovereign is responsible for other agents.
So there's a lot of like policing of each other in like these camps, and there are like speeches about like how the soldiers are expected to act as they go through French towns and like what they can and cannot do. And so like everybody from like it is sort of like keeping an eye on each other, and ultimately punishment is the responsibility of a captain in the army for the troops they oversee, but kind of everybody's watching each other.
Yeah. Yeah, but then of course, if the king like allows soldiers to do something illegal, the king is not held accountable for that. There's a, get
nice
out of
little loophole.
Yeah. Get out of jail, if you will. So that is a part of medieval law medieval warfare law that is in the play. And I think that also like that's a really important thing that Shakespeare brings up in the play, because like it really like frames the fact that like whatever the soldier characters do that is technically illegal, the audience should not expect Henry to be held accountable for that.
Yeah. Which is why like, I know we're just focused on Henry V, but like Henry IV, Prince Hal interacts with Bardolph, but like any sort of association with Bardolph in this play is wiped clean. And there's no existing relationship, and there's no like suspicion even that your old friend Hal is.
Yeah. Okay, so that is, like I said, that's another piece of medieval warfare law.
Yeah, it's also it's also like why maybe Henry doesn't. No, I mean nobody can get him in trouble for like the prank he pulls with Llewellyn's hat, right? So it's just, we talked about that as being like, this is like a weird moment.
Yeah.
You almost caused a duel, and then it's just like, oh, silly Henry.
Yeah, imagine if it was like a duel to the death and one of those two died.
Yeah.
And then Henry's like,
nope, he's the sovereign.
Yeah, I'm not responsible for illegal acts, but yeah. That is another medieval legal aspect of warfare. The next piece that Marin discusses is the treatment of occupied territory. And Marin asks, how did the real Henry treat the conquered inhabitants of Harfleur? Did he actually, quote, use mercy to them all, unquote? And then second, to what extent did the speech of Shakespeare's Henry and the conduct of the real Henry's troops comport with the then prevailing standards? And so one of the pieces that makes Shakespeare's Henry so forgivable is that in his like speech to the governor of Harfleur, he threatens all of these very horrible acts that will come upon Harfleur if they do not surrender. But he keeps mentioning mercy, mercy, mercy. He says that I think like 4 times. But the historical Henry, in the negotiations preceding the surrender of the town, the leaders of Harfleur had offered, quote, to deliver the town into the king's hand, their lives and goods saved, unquote. And then the king refused, the king having successfully insisted on, quote, their bodies and goods to stand at the king's pleasure, unquote. And after the surrender, which was achieved by agreement, quote, the soldiers were ransomed and the town sacked to the great gain of the Englishmen, unquote. The wealthy were allowed to pay ransom in return for permission to stay, but quote, a great part of the women and children were expelled from their habitations. Parents with their children, young maids and old folk went out of the town gates with heavy hearts, unquote. Also, quote, the priests had license to depart, leaving behind them their substance, unquote. The king then issued a proclamation in England, quote, that whosoever would inhabit in Harfleur should have his dwelling given him gratis, unquote. So, like, that's not the same situation, between Shakespeare's Henry and historical Henry.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like Shakespeare's Henry a lot more merciful than historical Henry. Would you say so?
I would say so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say so. And according to canon law, the concept of peace of God categorized 8 different types of person who were protected by war. And those were clerics, monks, friars, other religious pilgrims, travelers, merchants, and peasants cultivating the soil. Additionally, women, children, the aged, the sick, and other peaceable persons were protected by the code of chivalry. But like in this experience, like women, children, old people were kicked out of their homes to, make way for English soldiers. So there seems to be a contradiction, or not a contradiction, but Shakespeare writes like you said, more merciful Henry during this scene, which is also a little funny because Henry V, historical Henry V, declared the ordinances of war in 1419 to prohibit many of these violations. But siege warfare was a common occurrence and a tool in war during medieval England. And so sacking a town and its inhabitants was a normal occurrence. And these harsh norms were very, very rarely questioned in medieval times, but they were challenged by Renaissance writers who wrote on international law, or this idea of like there being a code, a legal code, a code of warfare.
Yeah.
Shakespeare's Henry also comments on quartering. The chivalric code of conduct, quote, required that a knight vanquished in battle be given quarter rather than being killed, that when taken prisoner, he must be treated as a gentleman, and that he be ransomed for a reasonable sum, not beyond his means to pay, unquote. His play also comments a little bit on assaulting women, and the consensus in that era was like, the law does not allow that, even like in times of war, you're not allowed to do that.
Yeah. It's specific. That's one of the things that like in going through Harfleur, he says like, do not, as we go through, do not do this.
Yeah. And then the last piece is also pillaging towns. That was not allowed by laws of war unless you were given permission by the king. So,
which, is the thing that, as we already talked about, Bardolph gets in trouble for, is that he steals some tablets from a church.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And churches were supposed to be like off limits during warfare.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next piece that Marin writes on is the legal code for prisoners. Shakespeare's Henry has a very cruel order to kill the French prisoners, and he makes this call on two grounds. Number one is it is a necessity, as the French appeared to be regrouping to attack. But then also, secondly, it's a reprisal for the unlawful attack on the servants who were guarding the rear camp and its plunder. And that second piece about it being a reprisal for something that's unlawful definitely makes Henry more compassionate. Like, it's because these people have been killed, not because we are going to be attacked by the French. But this account is different than Holinshed's version. If Holinshed's version of this incident is correct, the French raid is unlikely to have violated any laws of war. So the English rear camp constituted a lawful object of attack. In the absence of resistance, the immunity of persons serving the troops would have depended on whether they met the prevailing standards of innocence. So like being a child or something, but like, whatever that conduct would have been, like, these servants probably wouldn't have actually qualified for the standards of innocence. And so Shakespeare's Henry goes against Holinshed's version and adds this element that makes it okay and lawful that Henry would order for the French prisoners to be killed.
Gotcha.
But there was an eminent medieval jurist named John of Legnano who recognized that captors have a right to kill prisoners where there was, quote, fear of a disturbance of the peace, unquote. So I guess it could be like a contested issue.
Oh, okay.
After all the combat in the play then brings on a herald and some ambassadors, and there's a treaty, and this is like the final part of warfare. And this is the last piece of medieval warfare law that Marin writes about in this article. So one of the critical positions in medieval warfare was the position of the herald. And the herald carried messages between warring parties. It mediated and arranged the time and place of important battles, including Agincourt, in such a manner, according to, quote, the etiquette of chivalry, neither side would take unfair advantage of the other, unquote. And the herald also arranged truces. So heralds were recognized experts on the code of chivalry, and their verdicts were decisive for members of the International Order of Knighthood, including princes.
Okay.
So in a way, they refereed, or they also refereed tournaments, and at battles, they recorded who was present And
So
yeah,
this like herald character that comes in and out of the play Henry V, we see like the French herald. It's not just some guy. It's not
yeah,
just like there's a very specific purpose that this character
yeah,
has.
yeah.
And it's a pretty, for the purposes of wartime, very important position, even though it's kind of an ensemble type of
Role.
part in
Yeah,
the play.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so like the heralds would be wearing a different uniform that distinguished them,
Hmm.
and they were seen as this like
As like a
impartial.
non-combatant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. After the Battle of Agincourt, Montjoy, the character in
Yes.
Shakespeare's play, goes onto the field and advises the winner of his victory. So advises Henry that the English are victorious. Another really important position during medieval warfare was the ambassador. There are a lot of ambassadors in Shakespeare plays, but ambassadors, in addition to being messengers, they also had full powers to negotiate and conclude a treaty of peace. And we see this in Shakespeare's play. Historical Henry actually had a lot more involvement in the Treaty of Troy, but for the
Hmm.
purposes of the play, Exeter and the other
Hmm.
ambassadors are sent away to go use their judgment for this treaty
Yeah.
of peace.
They go off to have the conversation with the Queen of France also presiding, while
Yes.
Henry is able to woo Catherine a little bit.
Exactly. And then the last legal piece in medieval warfare would be the treaty.
Hmm.
And so both Henry's, historical and Shakespeare's Henry, used the Treaty of Troy and then also like his marriage to Catherine to change the French line of succession. And Henry has himself described in the treaty as Charles's son and heir of France. And so by doing this, Henry hoped to avoid a direct conflict with, again, the Salic law that prohibits the passing of the French crown through females or the female line. And in the historical treaty, the treaty was carefully drafted to make no reference to the Plantagenet claim to the crown of France. But this it didn't backfire, but it like backpedaled a little bit. In 1435, the Salic law did return, and the French jurists who were opposed to the treaty invoked the law in a new and expanded interpretation as a fundamental constitutional principle prohibiting the alienation of the French crown to a foreigner.
Ooh,
So,
okay.
in the end, this law that Henry used to like prove his claim to the throne ended up like unraveling this English claim to the throne.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is a lot of like legal jargon, a lot of like technicality, but I just want to quickly like go through the pieces as like a high level. This is what we learned today
Yes.
in Shakespeare and law. So Henry V as a play successfully and like truthfully represents the medieval warfare laws that were customary and standard in the medieval period, starting with the beginning of the play where Henry and his advisors are determining whether or not he has a claim to the throne and can actually pursue a just war against France versus an unjust war. And once this claim is solidified, the war is determined just, then Henry's advisor declares war on France through the legal means that were necessary during that time period.
Hmm.
And throughout the play, Shakespeare also makes references to the different aspects of warfare law, such as the responsibility of princes as it pertains to like their responsibility over their soldiers, as well as the treatment of occupied territory, especially during siege warfare, the legality surrounding prisoners, and concludes this play with the legal process of going from like the herald advising the winner of his victory
Hmm.
to the Treaty of Troy that provides Henry with his actual victory, which is the French crown, the French throne.
Wow.
Yeah. And according to this, to my source, who is a lawyer, he is impressed by Shakespeare's attention to historical detail and rules of law in international relations and diplomacy.
I'm also impressed.
Yeah. Whew. That was a lot.
That was, but I think it's super interesting to think that like what the most fictional thing in this play is, or what the most like early modern part of this play.
Mm-hmm.
Like Shakespeare's not like writing about like what the current experience of military life is. He's writing about with a lot of really solid knowledge about like the rules of warfare in King Henry V's time. And then maybe the only thing we could say is that he, invents these like common soldiers who are, yes, inexperienced in that they are young. That's like maybe the most inventive in terms of like how war was experienced in both like King Henry V's time and in Shakespeare's own time. That sort of idea of like these young boys who don't really know what they're doing and are scared also like is like maybe like the most fictional piece
yeah, in
of
addition
like,
to Henry's Mercy.
yeah, and Henry, oh yes, and Henry's Mercy.
Yeah,
These things that kind of are actually kind of like the more endearing parts, that Henry is merciful and he is like, he's got this very just cause. And then, you know, that we think of like these band of brothers, and like those two things are like, at least from the perspective of military history, there does seem to be like a fusing of like historical military law for Shakespeare. Also, like experienced soldiers were still a thing in his time. He wasn't completely making this up. And yeah, that like the very endearing parts about the war action in this play are Shakespeare's invention.
Yeah. I think it's also like a little clue to us in addition to, well, I want to preface this by saying when we studied Twelfth Night, it's very obvious how much Shakespeare knows about early modern law because he wrote all of these jokes that are possibly intended for the law students at Middle Temple. But I think this really is a testament to just that, like, I'm going to assume, I think this is canon. Shakespeare's a giant nerd. You know, he's reading up on like military warfare from medieval England and like making sure it's in there so that the audience knows like this is the scaffolding of this entire play. We know that like it's got to be a just war. We know that there are rules to the siege. There's rules to the treaty.
Yeah. And also like that's got to be at least like something that we talk about is like, you know, what's said and what's not said. And like what is sometimes not said is like things that are understood. It's like if you have to lay all this out for your audience, it's probably because they also understand that like, you know, there is such a thing as a just war, and there is such a thing as like what is mercy in the time of war and things like that. So the audience also has like there is a cultural knowledge of this, maybe not to the point that like Shakespeare is getting like making sure that all these boxes are checked, but there's a reason to include it too for the audience that's watching this like this piece of theater.
Yeah. And my last thought that has no substance behind it, no research behind it, but I'm also curious about the conversation about legitimacy in the time he was writing, because this is a play that is really scaffolding this idea that Henry V had a just war. His claim to the throne was legitimate. That kind of thing does have to be established for the sovereign. And so I'm curious what's going on in that time period with Elizabeth and all that.
Yeah. And like as we discussed with our episodes on bastards, Queen Elizabeth herself was still declared a bastard. And like there were all these within like a generation or two, there were several crises of legitimate inheritance to the throne.
Yeah.
And, you know, certainly, you know, living in the latter Tudor age, like the anxieties of who is or the question of like who is Elizabeth going to name as her heir to the throne.
Right.
Because we've just been through many years of Henry's children. You know, prior to Elizabeth, there was just like, you know, this
turnover, a high turnover of monarchs.
This crisis.
Yeah.
This inheritance crisis. So yeah, I can imagine, like, again, like absolutely speculating just based on like things that we have talked about in the past, that possibly like this need of being like Henry was good and Henry had the claim and it was all this was legitimate is maybe also like in reaction to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If anybody knows, if anyone has any articles, books, send it our way. Yes. Email us. Like, yeah.
But otherwise, thank you for listening.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone.
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at ShakespeareAnyonePod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Romeo and Juliet, Act 5, Scene 3, said by Romeo. I beseech thee, youth, put not another sin upon my head by urging me to fury.